Chapter 6: Devastation at Home and Rebuilding in Exile. On March 31st, 1959, around 3 p.m. Indian Standard Time, my party arrived in the Indian border village of Kenzamain, near Tawang. The moment I crossed into India, I felt a tremendous sense of relief. It didn't matter that we might have been a pitiful sight to the handful of Indian soldiers guarding the border. Approximately 80 of us, physically exhausted by the ordeal of hard travel. Even my mother said we no longer had to be afraid of the Chinese and could say what we thought. Obviously, my mother too had been carrying a heavy burden of having to weigh every word she uttered and every action she engaged in. We were met with an extraordinarily warm welcome from the local people and a cordial telegram from Prime Minister Nehru. My colleagues and I welcome you and send you greetings on your safe arrival in India. We shall be happy to afford the necessary facilities for you, your family and entourage to reside in India. The people of India, who hold you in great veneration, will no doubt accord their traditional respect to your personage. Kind regards to you. Nehru. We were formally received on behalf of the Government of India by a familiar face, P.N. Menon, an Indian Foreign Ministry official who had previously been stationed at the Indian mission in Lhasa. Waiting there was also another familiar face, Kazi Sonam Topgal, who had helped translate for me during my 1956 to 1957 visit to India. From the Indian border, we travelled to the town of Tawang in what was then known as the North-East Frontier Agency, NEFA, today as Arunachal Pradesh. On April 18th, I was taken by jeep to the town of Tezpur, where the international media were waiting. At the railway station, I felt overwhelmed to find thousands of telegrams of good wishes waiting for me, and approximately 100 journalists and photographers from across the world who had come to cover what they called the story of the year. I took the opportunity to issue a statement to the world, giving a full account of the circumstances that led to my escape, the spontaneous people's uprising in Lhasa, and our long, peaceful approach to seeking accommodation with the Chinese communists, and announcing that I was in India to oppose Chinese communist occupation of my country and to appeal to the free countries of the world. I concluded by saying that I hoped fervently that the crisis in Tibet would be over soon without any more bloodshed. 2 days later, Beijing issued a statement asserting that the so-called statement of the Dalai Lama is a crude document, lame in reasoning, full of lies and loopholes. It then went on to claim that I had been abducted by rebels from Lhasa. Understandably, there were heated debates in the Indian Parliament, the Lok Sabha, on what had just happened to Tibet, India's historic neighbour to the north. What the veteran politician and freedom fighter Jaya Prakash Narayan said captured the sense of frustration and moral dilemma felt by many Indian leaders at the time. No one expects India to go to war with China for the sake of Tibet, but every upright person, every freedom-loving individual should be ready to call a spade a spade. We are not serving the cause of peace by slurring over acts of aggression. We cannot physically prevent the Chinese from annexing Tibet and subduing that peaceful and brave people. But we at least can put on record our clear verdict that aggression has been committed and the freedom of a weak nation has been snuffed out by a powerful neighbour. Let us too not waver to tear the veil from the face of communism, which under the visage of the gentle Panchsheel hides the savage countenance of imperialism. For in Tibet, we see at this moment the workings of a new imperialism, which is far more dangerous than the old, because it marches under the banner of a so-called revolutionary ideology. From Tezpur, we travelled to Mussoorie, a beautiful British-era hill station in the foothills of the Himalayas north of Delhi. At every major train stop, thousands of Indians came to welcome me, shouting, "Dalai Lama ki jai," "Hail to the Dalai Lama," and "Dalai Lama Zindabad," "Long live the Dalai Lama." In Mussoorie, the government of India had established my first residence in exile. Here, on April 24th, Nehru came to meet me and welcome me in person to India. We spoke for over 4 hours. Since Nehru was one of the powerful voices that had urged me to return to Lhasa in 1957, I reported how, despite all my best attempts to deal fairly and honestly with the Chinese, according to the terms of the 17-point agreement, they had been impossible to work with. On June 20th, 1959, I gave my first formal press conference. I declared that Tibet had been independent, enjoying and exercising all rights of sovereignty, whether internal or external, and that by invading Tibet, Communist China's army had committed a flagrant act of aggression. This is something any objective person would agree with. In any case, I said at this press conference that since the Chinese side had violated key terms of the agreement, effectively, it had become invalid. If a treaty is violated by one of the parties to it, then it can legally be repudiated by the other party, at which point it is no longer in force. I also stated that as far as Tibetans everywhere are concerned, where my cabinet and my person are present, there will exist the legitimate government of Tibet. In the wake of my escape, many thousands of Tibetans managed to follow me into exile. At home in Tibet, the oppression had become intolerable. Listening to the accounts of the new arrivals in the face of the destruction of my people and all that they live for, I devoted myself in exile to the only courses of action left to me to remind the world of what happened and what was still happening in Tibet, and to care for the Tibetans who escaped with me to freedom. All that we had heard from the accounts of refugees and more was confirmed by the report of the International Commission of Jurists' Legal Inquiry Committee on Tibet at Geneva in July 1959, entitled "The Question of Tibet and the Rule of Law." What gives weight to this report is that it was commissioned and conducted by an independent judicial body beholden to no government or interested party. It was, in effect, totally impartial. The report concluded that the evidence points at least to a prima facie case of genocide against the People's Republic of China, and genocide is the gravest crime known to the law of nations. The Genocide Convention of 1948 condemns acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. In the second report from the International Commission of Jurists, Tibet and the Chinese People's Republic, published in 1960, the committee found that acts of genocide had been committed in Tibet in an attempt to destroy the Tibetans as a religious group, and that such acts are acts of genocide, independent of any conventional obligation. On September 4th, 1959, I made an important trip to Delhi. There, in addition to crucial meetings with Prime Minister Nehru, as well as other important leaders, including especially the President and the Vice President of India, I also met with ambassadors from various countries. Personally, the most moving part of this visit was the engagement I had with a gathering of several thousand Indians, organized by Bharat Tibet Sangh, India-Tibet Fraternity, and chaired by Acharya Kripalani, a noted Gandhian and social activist. Acharya remained a staunch supporter of the Tibetan cause and a dear personal friend until his death in 1982. Now that I was in a free country, I also set about consulting with international experts about taking the case of Tibet to the General Assembly of the United Nations. So while in Delhi that September 1959, I wrote to the Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, in view of the inhumane treatment and crimes against humanity and religion to which the people of Tibet are being subjected, I solicit immediate intervention of the United Nations. On October 21st, 1959, the General Assembly adopted a resolution sponsored by Ireland and Malaysia that called for respect for the fundamental human rights of the Tibetan people and for their distinctive cultural and religious life, and acknowledged that the fundamental human rights and freedoms to which the Tibetan people, like all others, are entitled, include the right to civil and religious liberty for all without distinction. I continued in my appeals to the UN Secretary General and to many governments, updating them on the worsening situation inside Tibet. Notably, in 1960, the United States government announced its support for Tibet's self-determination. In fact, I received 2 letters from Secretary of State Christian A. Herter, one in February 1960 and the second in October of that same year, assuring me that the United States position remained that the principle of self-determination should apply to the people of Tibet and that they should have the determining voice in their own political destiny. In 1961, at the 16th session of the UN General Assembly, a further resolution was adopted, sponsored by Malaya, Ireland, El Salvador, and Thailand. This resolution solemnly renewed the UN's call for the cessation of practices which deprive the Tibetan people of their fundamental human rights and freedoms, including their right to self-determination. One more resolution on Tibet was passed at the UN on December 18, 1965, at its plenary session, reaffirming the earlier resolutions and the UN General Assembly's grave concerns at the continued violation of the fundamental rights and freedoms of the people. In January 1960, I took the opportunity to visit Bodh Gaya and Sarnath to pay homage, respectively, to Mahabodhi Stupa with the sacred Bodhi tree and the site of the Buddha's first turning of the wheel of Dharma, this time with my mind in a more settled state. The last time I visited the sacred Buddhist site of Bodh Gaya in 1956, my mind had been racing with the question of whether to return to Tibet or seek asylum in India. In Sarnath, near Varanasi, I officiated for the first time at a ceremony for the full ordination of monks. Tradition demands that the monk officiating at a full ordination ceremony be someone who has himself received full ordination vows for 10 years, or at least 5 years earlier in the case of someone with exceptional qualifications. My 2 tutors insisted that I met the required qualifications and should conduct my first ordination ceremony for others at the site of the Buddha's first public discourse. I was then 26 years old. As someone to whom the identity of monkhood is close to his heart, this was both a profound honor and joy. I reflected on how fortunate I was to be able to perform such an ordination ceremony at the very place where the Buddha gave his first public sermon following his enlightenment, known as the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. Among those who took ordination in Sarnath was Dagyab Rinpoche, a high-ranking reincarnate Lama in the Gelug tradition. In Bodh Gaya, too, I conducted an ordination ceremony, and among those who took full ordination, there was Samdong Rinpoche, who would later become the first directly elected political leader of our exiled Tibetan community. There in Bodh Gaya, in January 1960, we also had what was effectively the first formal gathering of the Tibetan people in the free world. Key constituencies, including representatives from the 3 Tibetan provinces of Utsang, Kham, and Amdo, senior members of Tibet's major Buddhist traditions, abbots of the great monasteries, and delegations from various parts of India, came together to host a long life ceremony for my good health. At this ceremony, representing the Tibetan people in exile, they all took what was called the Great Oath of Unity, Nagantun Moche. Those present pledged that from now on they would strive for the unity of Tibetans from all three provinces and shoulder the responsibility to work for the common welfare of Tibet, under the Dalai Lama's leadership. It was in Bodh Gaya also, where we decided that we would strive to establish a representative form of government for future Tibet, and of course, for our exile community. Returning to Mussoorie, we commemorated the first anniversary of the Tibetan People's National Uprising of March 10th, 1959. In this way, we began the tradition of a major address to the Tibetan people on March 10th every year, marking this tragic anniversary. On that first anniversary, I stressed the need on our part to adopt a long-term view of the situation of Tibet. I said that for those of us in exile in a free country, our priority must be ensuring the survival of our civilization, especially through the protection of our distinct language and cultural traditions. I assured my people that truth, justice, and courage would be our weapons, and that we would eventually prevail in our struggle for freedom. While in Mussoorie, we began our plans to educate our younger generation. To this end, we set up the first Tibetan school in India, with an initial number of 50 mature students. Within a year, we were able to send some from this first batch to various parts of India, as well as remote areas in Nepalese border regions like Khumbu Valley, to teach Tibetan refugee children, including the teaching of English language as well. On April 30th, 1960, I arrived in Dharamsala, which was to become my permanent residence in exile. There we reconstituted what was, in effect, a Tibetan government in exile, called at the time the Central Tibetan Secretariat, later renamed the Central Tibetan Administration, CTA. With the help of my colleagues, I initiated a two-pronged strategy. There was first and foremost, after caring for the immediate necessities of more than 80,000 Tibetan refugees, the need to establish resettlements for the Tibetans in a way that would enable us to preserve our culture and identity while in exile. The second was to reach out to the governments around the world, the United Nations, and the international community to help resolve the Tibetan issue. An important part of this strategy was to draw international attention to the plight of the Tibetan people and China's unjust occupation of our country. At that time, my hope and efforts in this regard were directed toward the ultimate goal of restoring Tibet's independence. In my March 10th address of 1961 at my new residence in Dharamsala, I undertook to prepare a draft of the constitutional and economic structure to which I aspired for our country, and said that I would place it shortly before the representatives of the Tibetan people in India and neighboring countries for their consideration. Ever since my first visit to India in 1956, especially witnessing democracy in action by contrast with what I saw in Beijing, I have been a deep believer that democracy really is the most appropriate form of government. So, once I was resident in a free country, I strove to initiate a process of democratizing the Tibetan political system. It took me and my officials 2 years, following consultations with various experts, studying a number of constitutions around the free world, as well as many internal debates, to finalize a draft, which we proclaimed on March 10th, 1963. This constitution envisions a future Tibet as a unitary democratic state founded upon the principles laid down by the Lord Buddha. Key provisions included an independent judiciary, an elected National Assembly, prohibition of discrimination on any ground, such as sex, race, language, religion, social origin, property, birth or other status, as well as the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. The document also includes, as Article 36, Section E, a clause for the possible abolition of the Dalai Lama's authority by 2/3 of the majority of the National Assembly. Over the course of years, this document has been revised into a fully democratic model, governing the norms of the Tibetan people, at least in the exile community. In November 1963, at my residence in Dharamsala, most memorably, we held the first summit representing all Tibetan Buddhist schools, attended by, in addition to the heads of the lineages, senior lamas, reincarnate Tulku S, Geshe S, equivalent to holders of a doctorate in divinity, and scholars, as well as senior members of the Tibetan administration. This 4-day meeting offered an excellent opportunity to create the basis for a strong sense of unity across the diverse traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, as well as to encourage a united effort to preserve Tibet's rich religious traditions. One of the important topics that Prime Minister Nehru and I discussed in the early days of my exile was the education of the refugee children. Nehru emphasized that in order to preserve Tibetan culture and identity, it would be necessary to have separate schools for the Tibetans. He thus undertook to establish an autonomous body within the Indian Ministry of Education, with the Government of India bearing the costs. Furthermore, Nehru advised that while it was very important for our children to have a thorough knowledge of their history and culture, it was vital that they be conversant with the modern world, and hence that we use English as our medium of education. From this emerged a network of central schools for Tibetans, CST, producing generations of modern educated young Tibetans. During the 60s, we re-established in exile many of the historically important cultural and religious institutions of Tibet, including especially the monasteries and monastic universities belonging to the major schools of Tibetan Buddhism. New establishments founded in Dharamsala included the Thekchen Chuling Temple, the Tibetan Children's Village, TCV, the Tibetan Medical and Astro Institute, the Tibetan Institute of Performing Arts, and the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives. During this crucial decade, many of the refugees found work in the great effort of building roads at high altitude. I personally visited some of these road construction sites to encourage and give comfort to those many Tibetans who were engaged in such hard labor. A most unusual but memorable experience at one road construction camp took place when I visited Chamba in northern India. There was a substantial number of monks among the road workers, and since my visit coincided with the day of a required bi-monthly confession ceremony, I led the monks through the confession ceremony. Since the monks only had trousers and shirts, they had no choice but to participate in the ceremony in lay clothes. Recognizing that employment such as road construction would only be temporary, efforts were made to seek more long-term forms of livelihood for the refugees. Thanks to the generosity of several Indian states, we were able to establish more than 20 Tibetan settlements during the 1960s and early 1970s, especially in southern India. In this way, we ensured that, even in exile, we could live as a distinct community so that we could preserve our language and culture. We were also the beneficiaries of the generous support of many international aid agencies and non-governmental organizations, NGOs. 2 countries, Switzerland in the early 1960s and Canada in the 1970s, offered asylum to several hundred Tibetan refugees. We were also able to send many Tibetan children and young adults for education to the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Iran, as well as Japan, many of whom were later able to serve in various capacities in our offices in exile. Throughout this period, there was no contact with the People's Republic of China, principally because Tibet was, just as China proper, engulfed in the chaotic period of the Cultural Revolution. On May 27, 1964, sadly, Prime Minister Nehru passed away. He had been the constant face in all my international political dealings since I'd met him in Beijing in 1954, during my first trip to India, and then in my exile. And of course, he had been so supportive and generous to our initiatives for the Tibetan refugees. His successor, Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri, continued Nehru's policy of supporting the exile community, thus establishing an enduring position on the part of the Indian government in its support of the Tibetans in India. Shastri adopted a more robust position in relation to China, which was reflected in India's support of the UN resolution on Tibet of 1965. Sadly, Prime Minister Shastri died in 1966 while visiting Tashkent in Uzbekistan. He was succeeded as the Prime Minister by Nehru's daughter, Indira Gandhi, whom I had known because of my long friendship with her father. Indira was familiar with the Tibetan situation and the Tibetan refugees in India. In fact, she once sat on the board of trustees of the Tibetan Homes Foundation in Missouri. Meanwhile, inside Tibet, things were disastrous and grim. The response to my flight had been brutal and the repression terrible, as if people were being punished for my escape. The most powerful account of what happened in this period is given in the 70,000 character petition written in Chinese by the Panchen Lama in 1962, which Mao Zedong described as a poisoned arrow shot at the heart of the party. The petition, submitted to the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, but seen by the outside world only years later, was entitled "A Report on the Sufferings of the Masses in Tibet and Other Tibetan Regions, and Suggestions for Future Work to the Central Authorities through the Respected Premier Zhou." Unlike me, the Panchen Lama had stayed behind in occupied Tibet, at his monastic base Tashi Lumpo in Shigatse. Following a tour of parts of Tibet, he wrote, "Because of many errors of mistakes, serious harm was done to agriculture and animal herding production. Because the anguish of such severe hunger had never before been experienced in Tibetan history, and was such that people could not imagine it, even in their dreams. The masses could not resist this kind of cruel torment, and their condition declined daily. Therefore, in some places, colds and other such minor infectious diseases caused a percentage of people to die easily. In some places, many people directly starved to death because the food ran out. In some places, there was a phenomenon of whole families dying out. No matter whether they were men or women, old or young, as soon as they saw me, people thought of the bitterness of that period and were unable to prevent tears flowing from their eyes. A few brave people among them said through their tears, 'Do not let all living creatures starve. Do not destroy Buddhism. Do not extinguish the people of our snowy land. These are our wishes and our prayers.' These are the hopes, concise but comprehensive and profound, more urgent than wanting water when you are thirsty, of the broad masses of the monastic and secular people, produced by bitterness resulting from what has happened and from the existing situation in Tibetan areas." One of the key concerns raised by the Panchen Lama in his petition relates to the issue of protecting Tibetan nationality and cultural identity within the People's Republic of China. Clearly, this concern came from the fear of Han chauvinism. He writes, "Once a nationality's language, costumes, customs, and other important characteristics have disappeared, then the nationality itself has disappeared too. In relation to the destruction of religion, the Panchen Lama declares, "Before democratic reform, there were more than 2,500 large, medium and small monasteries in Tibet. After democratic reform, only 70 or so monasteries were kept in existence by the government. This was a reduction of more than 97%. In the whole of Tibet in the past, there was a total of about 110,000 monks and nuns. After democratic reform was concluded, the number of monks and nuns living in the monasteries was about 7,000 people, which is a reduction of 93%. The Panchen Lama's courage in writing in the above manner in the midst of the cruelest totalitarian oppression deserves the deepest admiration. It was written on the basis of his visiting many Tibetan areas, including Amdo, as well as East Turkestan, Xinjiang. In personal terms, he paid a terrible price. The petition confirmed my worst nightmare of what might have happened in the wake of the Tibetan people's uprising of March 1959 and my own escape. In 1964, the Panchen Lama was declared an enemy of the Tibetan people and publicly humiliated through the ritual of what came to be called struggle sessions, which would later become a hallmark of the Cultural Revolution. He was arrested and remained in prison until 1977, and then kept under house arrest until 1979. After his release, the Panchen Lama spoke out forcefully on behalf of the Tibetan people and criticized Chinese policies in Tibet. Particularly, in March 1987, he spoke candidly at the Tibet Autonomous Region's Standing Committee meeting in Beijing during the National People's Congress, criticizing communist Chinese policies inside Tibet, including especially the language policies, as well as Han chauvinism. My heart goes out to the memory of this heroic figure who did so much to protect the Tibetan people in their darkest hour, especially after his release in 1979 and until his sudden death under suspicious circumstances in January 1989. 5 days before his death, I understood that he made the following statement: "Since liberation, there has certainly been development, but the price paid for this development has been greater than the gains." I was fortunate to have phone conversations with him during his trips outside the People's Republic of China. This gave me a chance to express my thanks and admiration personally. The Panchen Lama was 3 years younger than me and had been my companion on the trips to China in 1954 to 1955 and to India in 1956 to 1957. Not a man of patience for diplomatic niceties. For the Panchen Lama, what mattered was honesty and integrity. Over the years, the Chinese communists tried to create and exploit conflict between us on the old colonial principle of divide and conquer. Yet even though we were unable to have contact for a long time, I advocated awareness of the fate of Tibet to the outside world, while with immense courage he presented the truth to the leaders of the oppressors themselves. The Panchen Lama's petition describes the situation before the Cultural Revolution, which Mao unleashed in May 1966 and which lasted until his death in 1976. Recognizing that China as a whole suffered immensely during this decade of turbulence, it was a terrible time, especially for Tibet. It began in Lhasa with Red Guards invading the Yokhang Temple, destroying ancient frescoes and images and burning scriptures in the courtyard in the name of abolishing the Four Olds, which were old ideology, old culture, old habits, and old customs. As I noted in my March 10th statement of 1967, Among the countless images destroyed was one of Avalokiteshvara, made in the 7th century, and considered one of the most sacred icons of Tibet. The destruction spread to the Nobulinka and across the city, and ultimately there would be street battles in Lhasa and other cities between rival factions. In this chaotic period, not only did many thousands die, but numerous historic monuments were destroyed, such as Ganden Monastery, founded by Tibet's great philosopher Saint Tsongkhapa in 1409. In essence, everything Tibetan was attacked. The practice of the Buddhist faith was outlawed. Incense burning, ceremonies and festivals were banned. Traditional songs and dances were prohibited. Struggle sessions and public humiliations were meted out to monks and class enemies. In brief, Tibet experienced a large-scale and systematic attempt to erase its cultural identity and collective memory. If any of my colleagues who fled with me into exile in 1959 ever had any doubts about the correctness of our course of action, then the Cultural Revolution utterly dispelled them. Had I stayed in Tibet, I wouldn't have been able to do anything meaningful in the face of this insane and systematic onslaught. In January 1976, the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai died, followed by Marshal Jude in July and Chairman Mao himself on September 9th. Mao's legacy includes the deaths of more than 40 million people, especially during the famine of his Great Leap Forward in 1958 to 1962. On the geopolitical side, instead of decolonizing as the great empires were doing at the time, Mao's China chose a policy of colonialist imperialism in relation to Tibet, Mongolia, and East Turkestan, couched ironically in strident anti-colonial rhetoric. What this has created for Mao's successors is a legacy of perpetual instability, paranoia, and repression, especially against the non-Chinese nationalities. As a result, today, even after more than 7 decades of occupation, any expression of Tibetan identity is seen as a threat questioning Chinese legitimacy in Tibet. The death of Mao was the beginning of an intense power struggle in which Mao's wife Jiang Qing, who had been one of the instigators of the Cultural Revolution and the Gang of Four, lost power to the faction headed by Hua Guofeng. While this was happening, I was watching events from India with interest and some hope. Among the noticeable changes was the visit of the former American Defense Secretary James Schlesinger for a 3-day tour of Tibet soon after Mao's death. Schlesinger's visit was the beginning of a chance to obtain a clearer picture of the conditions inside Tibet. I was told that he described the communist Chinese presence there as oppressive, even by colonial standards, since it aimed at total domination. Until then, the People's Republic of China had only allowed foreign visits to Tibet from among their close allies. Shortly after, Beijing began to allow sympathetic Western journalists and writers into Tibet. For nearly 2 decades since my flight into exile in 1959, the entire Tibetan plateau had been run like one giant prison. No one was allowed to communicate with the outside world, which meant that, except for a few messages received through secret channels, the Tibetans living in exile were totally cut off from their compatriots and families back in our homeland. Back home, Tibetans had been told that those in exile were living in abject poverty, since it was only the socialist countries that had successfully achieved economic prosperity. When the dust settled from the power struggle in the Chinese Communist Party in the aftermath of Chairman Mao's death, it was my old acquaintance Deng Xiaoping who emerged as the paramount leader of China in 1978.